Boris Johnson, the man who once dominated British politics, the larger-than-life figure who bulldozed his way through Brexit, scandals, and a global pandemic, is restless. Officially, he's retired from frontline politics, spending his days writing books, enjoying time with his family, and, as he claims, building a new kitchen. But behind the scenes, something far bigger is brewing. His allies whisper of unfinished business, and sources close to him say he's growing bored, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to return. Despite what he says publicly, Boris has never truly stepped away from politics. He's been keeping his network alive, making quiet phone calls, attending high-profile international events, and maintaining key relationships. In the last few months alone, he's reportedly held multiple calls with Donald Trump, kept in touch with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and reached out to at least 2 former cabinet ministers for private policy discussions. But what's even more shocking is that his old allies inside the Conservative Party are starting to rally behind him once again. The timing could not be more dramatic. The Conservative Party is collapsing. Reform UK, once dismissed as a fringe movement, has surged to 27% in the polls, putting them ahead of Labour and leaving the Tories gasping for air at a humiliating 21%. This is a full-scale meltdown, reminiscent of the existential crisis they faced in 2019 when Nigel Farage's Brexit party nearly wiped them out. Back then, they turned to Boris. Back then, Boris saved them. Now, history is repeating itself, but this time, things are even worse. Nigel Farage isn't just an outside force threatening the Tories, he's building an entirely new power base with Reform UK. The old strategy of cutting a deal with him won't work. The whispers inside Westminster are turning into murmurs of panic. The only person who can match Farage's media presence, his political charisma, and his ability to rally voters is Boris Johnson. This is why, despite the denials, Boris's name keeps coming up. His approval ratings, once in freefall, have improved, standing at -17, which is still higher than Liz Truss -45 and even Rishi Sunak -22. He remains the only Conservative figure with the ability to command headlines, dominate the airwaves, and pull the party back from the brink. One of his former cabinet ministers put it bluntly, "If Reform keeps going the way they're going, it's going to be immensely painful for the party." When the Conservatives need a Hail Mary, they tend to look at Boris. But if Boris does decide to return, the biggest obstacle in his way isn't Reform, Farage, or even public opinion. It's Kemi Badenoch. As leader of the Conservative Party, Badenoch holds the final say over who gets selected as a candidate. Boris, having resigned as an MP in 2023 over Partygate, needs a seat in Parliament if he wants to make a comeback. And while some of his allies believe that if a local Conservative association backs him, Badenoch won't be able to stop it, the reality is far from simple. She has no interest in allowing Boris back in unless she has no other choice. The question now is how bad things need to get before the Conservatives do make that choice. The answer might come sooner than anyone expects. Just this week, Reform UK won its first ever council seat in Wales, a shocking victory that saw them wipe out nearly 50% of Labour's previous vote share. This isn't just a warning sign, it's an earthquake. Reform is no longer a protest movement, it's an electoral force that could obliterate both Labour and the Conservatives, if given the chance. And make no mistake, Boris knows this. His public warning to the Tories was clear. Reform was on 0% when I was running the show. The message couldn't be more obvious. Under Boris, Reform had no traction. Under Sunak and Badenoch, it's thriving. The bigger fear for Labour and the Tories isn't just losing a few seats, it's the possibility that Reform could become the second largest party in the country. Recent polling suggests that Reform could kick 60 Labour MPs out of Westminster and add as many as 76 MPs to Parliament. This is no longer a political side story. This is the beginning of a full-scale realignment in British politics, one that could see both Labour and the Conservatives permanently weakened, while Farage cements his hold on the right-wing vote. Yet, while the Reform earthquake shakes up Westminster, Labour has found itself dragged into yet another scandal. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is facing serious questions over her LinkedIn profile inaccuracies and allegations regarding expenses during her time at Halifax Bank of Scotland. A whistleblower has claimed there was a toxic spending culture under Reeves's leadership, with excessive expenses being submitted by her and senior colleagues. The BBC has reported that HBOS opened an internal investigation into the matter between 2006 and 2009. However, Reeves has strongly denied the allegations, stating, "No one ever raised any concerns about my expenses when I worked for Halifax Bank of Scotland, but the damage has been done." In the public eye, Labour is supposed to be the clean alternative to the chaos of the Tories. Yet, with each new scandal, they look less and less like a government in waiting and more like a party that's just as entangled in controversy as their rivals. For Boris Johnson, the timing of all of this couldn't be better. He sees the vacuum of leadership in the Conservative Party. reality. He sees reform devouring the right-wing vote. He sees Labour fumbling scandals of their own. And most importantly, he sees an opportunity. The only question is, will he take it? If Boris does decide to return, it will be the most explosive political comeback in modern British history. The media will go into overdrive. The Tory establishment will be thrown into chaos. Reform UK will have a true challenger. And Labour, they'll find themselves trapped between two forces that threaten to dismantle their entire power base. But there's another possibility, a far darker one. What if Boris's return isn't about saving the Tories but finishing them off? What if Boris sees that the Conservative Party as it stands cannot survive? What if he's planning something far bigger than a simple return to Westminster? His calls with Donald Trump, his media dominance, his populist instincts. Could it be that Boris is considering something that no one is prepared for? Could he be planning to abandon the Tories entirely and lead a new movement? The truth is, Boris never does anything without a plan. And while the establishment watches him nervously, while the Tories pray for a saviour, and while Reform UK and Labour fight for dominance, he sits back, calculating his next move. Because when Boris Johnson does return, it won't be to play by the old rules. It will be to rewrite them entirely. The tension in Westminster is reaching a boiling point. Every day the Conservative Party inches closer to an all-out implosion, and Boris Johnson is watching, waiting, ready to pounce. But with Nigel Farage on the rise, Labour falling apart under its own weight, and Kemi Badenoch trying desperately to hold the crumbling Tory party together, the question is no longer if Boris will return, it's how. Right now, the Tory establishment is fractured beyond repair. The old guard, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, and even Badenoch herself have utterly failed to contain the rise of Reform UK. While the Conservatives scramble for answers, Farage has seized the political narrative, capturing the support of working-class voters, disillusioned Brexit supporters, and those furious with the government's handling of immigration, the economy, and national identity. And now, Reform has drawn blood. Their shock victory in Wales, where they wiped out Labour in a local council election, wasn't just a fluke, it was a warning shot. The establishment is shaking, and Boris's allies know it. One close friend of Boris put it bluntly: there is no one in the Conservative Party right now who can take on Farage. The media love him, the public listen to him, and whether we like it or not, he's winning. And that's where Boris changes the game. His record speaks for itself. He led the Tories to an 80-seat majority, took on the EU, and crushed Labour's Red Wall in 2019. The Tory base still remembers that victory, and they know that no one in their current leadership has any hope of repeating it. But if Boris does return, it won't be as a humble MP. It won't be as someone waiting to be handed power. No, Boris will come back to take the throne. The establishment knows this. That's why they're afraid. That's why the Conservative elite, those who forced him out over Partygate, are desperate to keep him out. They fear what happens when Boris takes back control, because when he does, there will be no stopping him. But here's the most terrifying question of all. What if Boris doesn't want to save the Tories? What if he sees the writing on the wall? What if he knows that the Conservative Party is already dead, that Farage has already claimed its soul, and that the only way forward is to burn it down and start again? That, right there, is the nightmare scenario for Westminster. Not Boris returning as a Tory leader, but Boris joining forces with Farage, or worse, Boris leading his own movement. Because if that happens, the entire British political system will be shaken to its core.